lieber Goldman, lieber Eckstein, dear colleagues, lieber Herr Huth, it's an honor and pleasure to be with you. It's the first time to be at an Episcopal University in the United States. I know it's really an honor, and I'm proud to be here. I don't know whether I've brought the right paper, but I try to develop my points of view in 4 steps. I'm a liberal Protestant coming from Germany, being informed by the tradition of German culture Protestantism, but I don't share the deeply anti-Catholic sentiments that many liberal European Protestants had during the 19th and in the 20th century. The term ecumenism is open to wide interpretation. In the original Greek, as you know, ekumene means the whole populated earth, the circle of the world, or simply the world. In the language gained of theologians and church officials, however, the term was often given an entirely different degree of meaning, beginning in the late 19th century. We can, at least in a very German perspective, differentiate at least 4 dimensions. In church discourse, ecumenism at first sight mainly constituted an emancipatory term for movements of all kinds of groups in different, mainly Protestant churches in Europe and the United States, which wanted to find, in the face of hard cultural struggles between Protestant and Catholics, as well in view of a dogmatically narrow and highly doctrinaire confessionalism, something like a cross-denominational unity of all Christians, overcoming differences to rediscover traditional or fundamental similarities. This conception of ecumenism is determined by a global view and marked by a decidedly hopeful perspective. When you read the text from the 1920s, 1940s, 1960s, you find a lot of euphoria when people talk of ecumenism. The utopia that Christians could join across denominational boundaries in common worship was institutionalized in the first conference in World Mission held in Edinburgh in 1910. Subsequently, the movement for faith and order was created in addition to a second ecumenical movement for life and work. Both these movements were joined in the Ecumenical Council of the Churches in Geneva, created in 1948. This type of ecumenism was traditionally dominated by Protestant churches and denominations, primarily, and especially after the Second World War, by churches from the US and from Britain. These English-speaking groups overtook the large ecumenical conferences as opportunities to teach other churches, for example, the German Lutheran churches, a lesson or two on the spirit of religious values of modern human rights discourse. This type of ecumenism always had a very strong political agenda. But after the accession of some Eastern Orthodox churches to the Geneva World Council of the Churches in 1961, in the course of the Third General Assembly, this institution has attempted to pacify several internal political and theological conflicts. These proved highly difficult, while the Orthodox and non-Roman Catholic churches disavow the possibility of women priesthood, the Roman Catholic Church as well. Female ministers and bishops are entirely natural for Protestant churches. But even within some member churches of the Geneva Council, such as the Anglican churches, we can witness strong internal conflicts, such as the question whether openly homosexual men can be ordained as ministers or bishops. Here the conflict runs between African and Asian Anglican churches on the one hand, and Anglicans as well as Presbyterians in the US, Canada, Australia and Europe. Nowadays, we can feel little enthusiasm for this type of ecumenism of the Geneva conferences. The bureaucratic apparatuses are mostly sclerotic and rigid. The conferences are dominated by an uninspired boredom of self-satisfied functionaries. I know what is going to happen there. It is very understandable that the Roman Catholic Church, based on its doctrine as the only true Church of Jesus Christ, under the primacy of its Pope, keeps its distance to the World Council of Churches. It doesn't want to be one among many. Therefore, the Roman Catholic Church takes part only in, as you all know, a select few activities of the Geneva institution, such as, let me give this as one example, such as the conciliatory process for peace, justice, and integrity of creation. Compared to other NGOs, the Council, massively influenced by Eastern intelligence service until 1989, has lost a lot of its political influence. My analysis of the situation in Geneva is, as you see, quite critical. Now, let me proceed to a second, significantly different use of the term ecumenism. Ecumenical activities also encompass the many dialogues between individual churches or federations of churches to build bridges across past dogmatic differences. Represented by a designated cardinal of the Curia of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, from 2001 until 2010 by Cardinal Walter Kasper, nowadays by Cardinal Koch, a Swiss theologian, the Vatican is engaged in discussions with representatives of several Orthodox churches to enable, among other projects, a papal visit to Moscow. Rome is also involved in discussions with the Lutheran World Federation on controversial issues, while a dialogue with the Anglican community is in place to attempt to bridge past dogmatic differences. Sometimes these discussions end in continued discord, leaving theologians on either side with ample opportunities to reassure each other of a continued need for exchange. Sometimes they celebrate festive rituals in meaningful occasions, signing documents of consent or declarations, which then still need to be received in the individual churches. One example was the negotiation of the so-called Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification on October 35, 1999, that is on Reformation Day in Germany, and under great public attention, the Cardinal of the Curia, Edward Cassini, President of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, and the President of the Lutheran World Federation, the Brunswick Bishop Christian Krause, signed the so-called Joint Official Declaration, including an appendix in spite of the vocal protest of nearly 160 German professors and university theologians who perceived this a dilution of basic ideas of the Protestant Reformation. However, strictly speaking, there was no substantial consensus on central elements of Luther's teaching on justification. This was soon demonstrated by an act of symbolic papal policy. Only 7 weeks after this intriguing media spectacle, John Paul II announced an ordinary jubilee, enabling believers to receive a special jubilee absolution after worthy reception of the sacrament of repentance. This was very much in the spirit of those indulgences that the 16th century reformers had deemed timely, unevangelical, and in conflict with New Testament teaching. In his August 2000 declaration, Dominus Jesus, on the unity and universality in salvation of Jesus Christ and the Church, the then prefect of the CDF, the current Pope, clarified with particular dogmatic clarity that the communities arising from the Reformation are not to be seen as real churches or equal footing with the Roman Papal Church. The Protestant German theologian Eberhard Jüngel, who taught at the University of Tübingen, has accordingly issued a word of warning in view of this second interpretation of ecumenism. It should not result in a type of, that's a neologismus, Schummelökumene, a surface-only kind of ecumenism. A third conception of the term ecumenism can be called a genially German interpretation. In Germany, Ökumene is seen as something very different from the way the concept is perceived in other European and I think as well in North America, in other European states as well as in North America. The German nation state of 1870-71 was aggressively dominated, not least due to the exclusion of Austria, by Protestants who polemically posited a national Leitkultur, a guiding culture, excluding Catholics as second-class citizens in the many culture wars or Kulturkämpfe of the time. The argument used back then strongly resembled, by the way, those employed by contemporary Islamophobes. Only under the pressure of Nazi persecution did Christians of both denominations find some kind of common Christian identity. In West Germany, Ökumene became an imperative of political stability, similar to the corporate social partnership between employees and employers in what was called the soziale Marktwirtschaft, social market economy, Rhineland capitalism, as many American economists call it. In the context of the East-West conflict, the West German response was cultural struggle shall be replaced by Ökumene, class struggle by social partnership. Therefore, Ökumene has become a basic term in the vocabulary of post-war political stability in the Bonn Republic, where democratic politics is always aimed in part at reaching compromise, then religious differences can legitimately be downplayed and religious certainties can be put into perspective. An ideologically neutral state, as well as an open pluralist society, should and must not, if only out of self-interest, intercede on behalf of one specific religious actor. It must treat religious actors equally and should therefore be interested in pacifying any potential conflict. The state, therefore, seeks Ökumene between the two large churches, because this will always promote its own interest in enhanced integration. The churches, on the other hand, also have substantial interest in this process beyond all religious and theological thinking. By acting jointly in the political arena, they can become a powerful, unified interest group lobbying for their common interest or interests. Thus, ecumenism in Germany is driven as much by realist necessity as by a desire for theological rapprochement. And that it's really important that ecumenism is in my country a very political topic. 4 or 6 weeks ago, a number of prominent parliamentarians from all parties signed a declaration demanding Ökumene now, which neither Protestant nor Roman Catholic bishops really liked. But this was prominent lay Christians from all parties, very influential politicians who said, well, we really want it. We can identify, however, a fourth very different conception of ecumenism: ordinary quotidian ecumenical activity. Denominations are, as we all know, important in shaping our worldviews, but many people are not interested in both theological discourse and the high pathos of well-fed functionaries of ecumenism. Beyond all this, the common believers in Germany practice a high degree of simple quotidian ecumenism. That has a lot to do with the simple fact that young Catholic men engage themselves with Protestant women and so on. So there is something at a very different level. I call it quotidian ecumenism. Catholics often come to support their neighboring Protestant parish and vice versa. Joint services are held, even on Sunday, although Catholic bishops usually attempt to prohibit such practices, and cooperation is known in diaconical activities, such as the care for the elderly. This represents a very concrete type of ecumenism, which is not dogmatically constructed, but practiced on the ground. For the actors involved, this often leads to conflict with their own church hierarchies. They have to bear the costs of the fact that the very real diversity of lifestyles and practices is met with incompatible dogmatism by both churches. So, how can we describe the future of ecumenism in Germany? One has to differentiate. More diversity usually means more conflict, and it is therefore to be expected that the process will, beyond the superficial rhetoric, lead to an increased rate on positional differences between the Christian churches, such, let me take this example, such as in questions of bioethics or biopolitics. But it's very interesting to see that Protestant members of Parliament often take a very different point of view in questions of biopolitics than Catholic members of Parliament, even if they are members of the same party. The Christian Democratic Union, for example, suffers a little bit about this fact that there is always a Protestant minority that is in question of biopolitics much more liberal than traditional Catholic parliamentarians. Anyhow, the remaining deep theological differences between both churches are put into perspective by the fact that growing religious pluralism leads to an increased need to join forces in the public political arena. Traditional denominational trenches are increasingly bridged by the growing disinterest of the common believer in traditional theological differences. And you find a lot of theology students, I have to say, who are not really able to understand what the doctrinal differences in the 16th or 17th century have been. They just don't understand it anymore. At the local level, in the world of parishes and community deacons, Catholics and Protestants are increasingly unified in their skepticism towards their respective clerical hierarchies. It seems to me that quotidian ecumenism is particularly fruitful when it comes to criticizing the churches, which is something like a very paradox effect, but you just have to read the papers and you can experience this. Well, so, my answer to the question, what is the future of ecumenism, has a lot to do with the way I try to differentiate. Of course, quotidian ecumenism has a future. I'm quite skeptical about the situation in Geneva, and I'm quite skeptical in regard to the dogmatic dialogues between the Roman Catholic Church and other churches. There might be some progress between the Orthodox churches and the Roman Catholic churches. Pope Benedict is very strongly interested in this type of ecumenical dialogue. He is not really interested in ecumenical dialogue with the Protestant churches. That has a lot to do with the fact that he comes from Germany, where he has suffered under certain Protestant conditions, but this is the fact. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions and to the talk.
Thank you very much, Professor Graf. I appreciate your comments. I'm going to begin and end with where I agree with Professor Graf, and in the middle, respond to his, I think, forceful statements with at least some attempt to make some responses. Where I agree particularly with Professor Graf is the importance of understanding ecumenism contextually. that is quite different in different situations. I think it's significantly different in the United States, in Africa, in Germany, different in France, different in England. Also, I'd want to note, I think it's important to understand that the very term ecumenism may need to be understood analogically. I'm not sure it means the same thing in the Protestant world as in the Catholic world because of the different meanings of terms. If you're seeking unity, what are you seeking the unity of? Protestants will often say they're seeking the unity of the church. No, Catholics will generally say we're seeking the unity of Christians because the unity of the church has never been lost. The very term ecumenism itself probably needs to be understood analogically. And this is one of the difficulties. How in the ecumenical movement, I want to go back to that term, how do we live with our different understandings of even what ecumenism is? We need to be ecumenical about ecumenism, so to speak, and seek a common understanding there. I do think that the sorts of ecumenism Professor Groff identified are quite important, particularly for understanding goals. Professor Groff noted it was in the Anglo-American world, particularly the American world, in the late 19th century, that people started using the word ecumenism in the modern sense, in the context of the student volunteer movement, students who were engaged in missions. It was essentially a pan-Protestant idea. Why? Given the importance of the mission in the world, the call to preach the gospel to the entire world in our generation, as they said, how can these small Protestant differences stand in the way of things? That's where ecumenism took on its modern meaning. And one of the reasons we have discussions like this, does ecumenism have a future, is because that early ecumenical discussion in the 1870s and 80s, their problem has largely been overcome. Some of the problems of ecumenism are that we've in fact solved many problems. As somebody has said, the source of most problems is solutions. You solve a problem and new ones develop. But we still have deep difficulties across the divide between, broadly speaking, Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox. Here I am hopeful in some respects, particularly about Catholic-Orthodox relations. And I think probably Catholic-Protestant relations will be improved by Catholic-Orthodox rapprochement. We'll see what is Rome really open to in terms of diversity within the church and living into new forms of diversity that are, I think, important. Now, I do think along the way there are tasks to be done. Now, I don't know if I put myself under, in my former various lives, self-satisfied functionary or well-fed ecumenist. Now, I must say, I did live in France. There's a saying in Germany, living high on the hog is essen und trinken wie Gott in Frankreich. To eat and drink like God in France. And it's very nice. I don't deny that. France is a nice place to live. However, along the way, it's not going to come quickly. There needs to be careful work and patience with the way in which concepts will work on the other side. The fact that concepts will work differently. What about, for example, that the Catholic Church continues to say that Protestant communities are ecclesial communities? What's going on there? I think it's very important for non-Catholics to try and understand precisely the point of that concept. Interestingly, at Vatican II, it was meant to be a positive move. It was a move between the all or nothing category, church or not church, to an ability to have scalar categories, I call them, more or less categories. It was an attempt, in fact, at least to find some ways within the structures of Catholic thought to reach out toward Protestants. What about, for example, the Indulgence Declaration, which I must say, that somebody at that time, a Lutheran, working on these questions, I was taken aback. But when one stops and works on it, I think, in fact, there is no contradiction between the Indulgence Declaration of the Jubilee and, in fact, the Joint Declaration. Quite interesting. In fact, the Joint Declaration influenced, I would argue, the Indulgence Declaration. Early on, it says that the one criterion, and it's criterion in the English and the German, the one criterion of the Christian life is the salvific action of God in Christ. In fact, it echoes the Joint Declaration. Now, Professor Groff may very well say this is a sign of Schummelekumenismus, that in fact the Indulgence Decree can echo the Joint Declaration. No, it's to say that one works on specific topics, one moves things along. Now, we have to see what happens. It is interesting. It is certainly true. 160 professors, or whatever the number is, signed the letter. Interesting, the German synods, for the most part, in fact, voted for the Joint Declaration. That's why it was approved. But I don't think I have illusions The crucial question is what happens to the Joint Declaration? Do people teach it in classes? Does it get cited? Does it get read? Or does it become like so many other ecumenical texts, and it becomes an interesting topic for somebody in 2085 to write a dissertation on? That's the question. What happens with it? And that sense reception is quite important. And here, at the end of my 10 minutes here, no, I actually have 3 minutes. So these are, I think, the important questions. I do want to come back to where I agree. I think there is the long task to be done. I think the ecumenical dialogue needs to go on, located within the larger context of Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox theologians speaking to one another. But I would agree that in the end, quotidian ecumenism, everyday ecumenism, what actually occurs on the ground at all levels, what happens on the ground, say, between the Protestant and theological faculties at Tübingen and Munich, what goes on the ground in congregations, etc., is of enormous importance. In the end, there are the underlying kinds of demographic, sociological, ecclesiological, in the largest sense, realities that make a difference. The ways in which one lives together. I heard the phrase in Germany, Möbelwagen Ecumenismus. The fact that people move from one place to another. My wife moved from Strasbourg to Bremen, and suddenly she wasn't a Lutheran in a hard sense anymore. She was a member of a united church. These kinds of demographic changes are important, but it raises the question of what are we supposed to do? You can talk about optimism, you can talk about hope. I think it's very important to distinguish the two. I am not optimistic ecumenically. I'm certainly not optimistic about particularly Protestant-Catholic relations, particularly perhaps in this country, for just the sorts of ethical and political issues that Professor Graf raised. However, I would say I have hope, which is a supernatural virtue, not necessarily directly related to the evidence in front of you. But now hope is an odd kind of matter. You wait and see what happens. You put the matters into the hands of God. While I was working in Strasbourg as either, again, a self-satisfied functionary or a well-fed humanist, when I would worship in my German, I could follow, because we had a German service, my wife in French, but we couldn't do both. My French was never that good. We would go to the English service, which was the only service, there was only one English language service in town, which was in the Dominican Church. The Church of England chaplaincy borrowed the Dominican Church. And it was only after I'd been there some years I realized this was Congar's church, Yves Congar, one of the most important Catholic theologians of the 20th century, one of the architects of Vatican II. Now he was in Strasbourg because he'd been banished from Paris, because they wouldn't allow him to teach at a center of influence. He was too dangerous. He was put out to the countryside, to the provinces, to Strasbourg, where he was, in fact, he did very little teaching. He was too dangerous. He went on doing his writing. He prepared the day. Now the day came in Vatican II when in fact the kinds of theological work he was doing was taken up and used, and it was important that he had prepared the way. He had hoped without evidence, and his work became important. I think ecumenical work has to be that way. We do our theological work, Schummel or otherwise. We do the best we can, and we try and turn that over in a hopeful way, even if we're pessimistic, in fact, on the basis of the evidence before us. So in some ways, I say I'm optimistic on Catholic-Orthodox relations. That could be because I know very little about them. My work has been all mostly in Catholic-Protestant relations. I am more pessimistic, but again, change comes. Let's end with one German example. In Strasbourg, when I was living in 1989, in March, I went to present some things on ecumenism to a group of East German pastors in Thuringia. What was striking in Thuringia in March of 1989, at least the pastors I was meeting with, was they thought nothing was going to change. It was the long, slow slog that perhaps one day their grandchildren would live in a different kind of world there in Thuringia. The reality is, 3 years later, the German Democratic Republic was gone. It disappeared far more quickly than any of them had any idea in their head. The God of history moves in his own ways. We can't predict it, we can't control it. We try to be ready for it, we hope for it, we make the contributions we can, and we trust that God will use them as God decides. That, it seems to me, is the future of ecumenism in the hands of the God of the future, the eschatological God. Whether he uses our work or not is in his hands, not ours, and I would hope that is at any rate an ecumenical commitment that both Orthodox Catholics and Protestants could agree on. Thank you, Professor Graf.
Professor Graf, Michael, Larry, friends. I was ordained into the Church of South India. Interestingly, it was an ecumenical church. For the first time, it brought together organically the Anglicans with the Reformed traditions. It came together in 1947, and I was ordained into that church. So in a sense, I embody some of the movement of ecumenism around the world. Let me start by making two introductory comments. The first is in terms of the topic itself. Does ecumenism have a future? I believe it does, and I believe it ought to have a future. Why do I say this? Let me leave 3 points with you. The first, it is not our endeavor, it's the prayer of our Lord. In a sense, it is the breathing of what God wants for those that God has breathed life into. And in that sense, it has a sense of agency that comes from God through the yearning prayer of our common Lord, Jesus Christ. But there is a second matter I want to leave with you. Ecumenism, in a sense, has a future and ought to have a future because the competitors for movements that in fact compete along with the ecumenism are scary, and that's why I think it ought to have a future. Think about 2 other movements that we can think of today. And this, in a sense, is a form of macro politics. If, as Professor Graf said, increasingly ecumenism is a political concept that actually has political implications in Germany, I suggest a form of macro politics we see is what we place the future of ecumenism within. On the one hand, we can say we have religious and cultural eclecticism, a kind of smorgasbord approach, where you can pick and choose, most of this shaped by the market that really would like to instantly produce for most people what they would like for themselves. And so on the one hand, you have this form of fragmentary forms of manipulation that allows us then to have a whole micropolitics in terms of religious and cultural eclecticism. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, another form of macropolitics is what we can say political and economic corporatism. A clear idea of working and building a corporation of sorts. So we're thinking of the multinational corporations. We're thinking of ways of holding together power blocks and regimes and market forces that homogenize what happens within us. It is within this context of competing macro politics that I believe that we need to embrace forms of ecumenism structurally in different parts of the world, and that therefore allow our churches, its leaders, its representatives, its denominational blocks along with their power to work together to forge what indeed is being faithful to this prayer that we believe is prayed by our one Lord, Jesus Christ. But I also am someone that works a lot with people's movements. I work with movements of the poor, particularly in India, the untouchable communities that are called the Dalits. And so there's also, I think, in a form of ecumenism, a need to think of micro-politics as well. It's very important. I noted the fact that we talked about ecumenism in terms of the dialogue and convergence and cooperation of the Roman Catholics, the Protestants, and the Orthodox. And yet, within micropolitics, most of us struggle with what happens with the new wave of Pentecostalism. A major form that actually calls for what indeed is the movement of ecumenism that works with local communities in different parts of the world. I'm primarily talking about Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And this indeed is very much part of what happens within the movements of micropolitics. I would like to place before us that ecumenism, in a sense, is both an inoculation against, but also a dispositional booster for. I think we need both of these, and one sees this working out within the forms of micropolitics of communities that are moving towards wholeness, sharing space as inhabited people in the whole world. I believe that much of what we do at a top-down level needs to also take place much more consciously from the bottom up, which involves a form of micropolitics. Ecumenism is a discourse, a movement, a sharing that inoculates against ignorance of the other. It inoculates against fear of the denominational other, and it inoculates against forms of hatred that allow for one denomination to have ideas that it can actually take over all. This, I believe, is extremely important in terms of what happens with local communities. Because in one sense, ecumenism is an alternate to forms of parochialism that cut us away from understanding that we are the people that inhabit the one world. So this is why I believe that we cannot allow ecumenism to rest in peace. Of course, I agree with Professor Graf that many of the institutions that were formed in the middle of the 20th century were contextually important. Either bringing together the Anglophone world, the ex-colonies, and therefore it was a form of strange post-colonialism where a rearrangement of forces were taking place. So I also feel that these larger institutions may gradually actually die off. Of course, they have enough foundation money that they will keep going for a long time, and they have land that they can sell. Some of what we know as buildings are sold, and paid into pensions. All of this can take place, right? But I have a feeling that that form may in fact be settled. I'm much more interested in terms of some of the agency of this, some of the synergy of forms of ecumenism being alive in order to inoculate peoples against forms of ignorance, fear, and hatred. Along with that, I believe it needs to inoculate us against what I'm seeing in the field as circular forms of proselytization. It's like musical chairs. Music is played, someone gets left behind. Everyone's really sitting in the same chairs, but you kind of feel that you've got somebody out and you really have your own chair. So there's a form of circular proselytization. I think inoculating against, where ecumenism actually is a spirit, actually also undercuts this form of circularity. That if you are in the field, you'll see that this is a major problem in terms of what's happening. But apart from just being an inoculation against, I really believe that ecumenism is a dispositional booster to much of us in terms of what we can be about together as a community that shares the whole inhabited world. It is here that I believe that forms of religious civility are encouraged. It is here that I believe that interdenominational spaciousness of hermeneutics, of perspectives, of theological expositions and expressions, of liturgical ways of performing before God in awe and reverence. All of this basically is given a chance to fuel the fact that indeed the whole inhabited world has differences and they actually have space within our one world. I truly wish for ecumenism to have a future. And I believe it is both within the micropolitics of holding this alive as an alternative to the other two forms of micropolitics that I talked about, that it's important to continue to work with ecumenism. But I also believe, as a student and a teacher of world Christianity, looking at the micropolitics of all that happens at the center. Most of the time we thought that world Christianity was at the edges, but at the center of Christianity, we really do believe that there is a way in which it serves as an inoculation against ignorance, fear, and hatred, and circular proselytization, but also actually is able to be a dispositional booster where religious civility and interdenominational spaciousness is something that we gift to all our communities in their own way. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you both for your very kind and polite answers and remarks. I very much like your notion of religious civility. In pluralist society, you need certain virtues, and religious civility, without any doubt, is something very, very important. I really liked Dr. Root's description that one has to take social context, specific political context into account, but would like to raise one question there. He said that you are quite optimistic in regard to the Catholic-Orthodox relations, and that you hope that the rapprochements there will change the picture in regard to the Protestant-Catholic relations. I must say that I am much more doubtful in regard to the Catholic and Orthodox relations. And this doesn't have much to do with questions of dogmatics, for example, the understanding of the clerical offices and so on, but has a lot to do with political or ethical implications. Coming from Germany, I know how difficult it was for the churches to understand or to accept basic principles of liberal democracy. Go to the Lutheran ethics of the 19th or early 20th century. Most Lutheran ethicists had been deeply anti-democratic, had the vision that this may be something happening in Western societies influenced by Reformed traditions, but that Lutherans are fundamentally alien to human rights thinking and so on. We still find this in the 1950s and early 1960s. Okay, the problem is, the same is true for many Orthodox churches. I don't say it's true for all Orthodox churches, but many Orthodox Christian churches are, in a sociological perspective, ethno-Christianities. They have a very close linkage of the notion of the nation and the idea of the church as a community. Read, for example, the so-called social doctrine of the Russian Orthodox Church. You have strong polemics against enlightenment. You have extremely strong polemic against the idea of individual rights and freedoms. You have fundamental anti-individualism. So I don't feel comfortable with the idea that the Roman Catholic Church is much more interested in getting in better contact with this type of Christianities, because in question of ethics there remain a lot of problems. Again, the Roman Catholic Church took had in some European countries a lot of difficulties in accepting liberal political orders. It has changed after 45 with Christian democratic parties, for example. It has changed through the Second Vatican Council. But whenever I ask Catholic friends and colleagues, what do you think about the Orthodox ethics? Let's talk about this question, and let us not talk about highly sophisticated dogmatic problems. Well, the answer is generally a lot of frustration, because we don't have any answer to this. And I'm very thankful for you that you mentioned the new Christianities of the Global South. Pentecostalism, we are still, let me be very cautious. It's extremely difficult. I read a lot about Pentecostalism, beautiful books written by American and British sociologists, but extremely difficult to understand what is really going on there. But this is, as you all know, a very important type of new Christianity, and it raises many, many questions. Of course, we have to do careful work, and we have to clear our concepts, but again, there is a fundamental problem. We can use sociological language, or we can use traditional ecclesiological language, but generally they don't harmonize. Yeah, so taking some sociological description about Eastern Orthodox Christianities, they are churches of a very different type. The idea of the nation state, ideas of the divine selection of a certain group of people and so on, play an important role in their self-understanding. And ecumenism shall not mean that one doesn't talk about these very difficult implications. Thank you.